In software development, we talk frequently about elegant solutions. And so what is elegance? I posed this question to Steve Klabnik's Philosophy in the Time of Software mailing list, which he set up. It's a really cool list. I know nothing about philosophy. I've never studied it. And if you join the list, you'll see that all I do is ask questions every once in a while and then sit back and let all the philosophers have at it. And I posed this question to them and didn't have time to begin to grok everything they were saying. So I was hoping, Carlicia says my slides are off-centered. Is that correct? Good enough. Close enough for jazz. So I've kind of fallen back to my own definition of elegance, being that anytime I come with a solution that's a win-win, because most of the time we're having to deal with trade-offs. The code I'm committing and deploying either performs better, but now it's harder to read, or now the UX, this is more secure, but it's less convenient for the end user. And we've all gotten used to that. That's mostly what we have to do, except that every once in a while we will come across that solution that is both and instead of either or. Over the years, I think we've seen several solutions that are elegant at a large scale within our industry, or at least moving us closer to elegance. And whether those are at the language level, process, frameworks, or QA techniques, there's a lot of things that have been invented or rediscovered or introduced into our communities. Now, I've mentioned TDD debate. I don't really intend to get into a lot of the details here, which will probably relieve a lot of you. But thinking through these different hangouts that they had, I think helped me identify one way in which DHH went wrong. And I think that the same pattern can apply to a lot of different situations in regard to these evolutions of elegance. So my idea is this, that any time an elegant solution gets over the initial adoption curve, I believe we start to see various corrosive effects from groups within the community. And one of those is the group of people who start to, I guess, trade on the thing for their own gain. And not all of that's malicious. Some of it's done with good intentions. But you know, I tend to think of consultants going into the companies to try to, you know, maybe do Agile, or we see things like Scrum certifications, things where it seems like, you know, people have kind of lost sight of what the original idea was in the first place. A second group I like to think of as marooned explorers. The example that comes to mind is mocking within testing. As unit testing started taking off, we started seeing patterns emerge around mocks and needing mocks to help us isolate the code under test. And then, for good reason, many people wanted to explore that. How far can we take this? If a little bit of mocking is good, then maybe a lot of mocking is great. And it's great that we do those, you know, go off on those excursions and see. But I think a subset of those people sometimes get stuck out there, and then that can create problems for the original thing. So some people come into a code base and say, wow, there's mocks everywhere, and it's really difficult to change the tests, and can sometimes draw the wrong conclusion that, well, testing itself must be a bad thing. And then the last group is one I think I fall into and a lot of us struggle with. And because I think at the end of the day, any conscientious developer would like to be able to reflect on their work and see if what they've done during that day is something positive or negative. And you know, this is really the metrics problem. It's easy to get caught up in the tangible things we can measure and say, well, I wrote a lot of tests today, I wrote a lot of code today, I committed and pushed a lot of things today. But it's more important that we be able to take that step back and try to look at some of the more intangibles. Say, are the practices and disciplines we're putting into use, are they actually working for us? Are they actually creating quality? So whether due to ignorance or malice, I think all these groups, all of these corrosive effects are really just variations on mistaking the means for the end or putting the means above the end. And it can be difficult to judge, especially once something is into or past the adoption phase, because there's a lot of activity around it. And are we seeing corruption of an elegant idea, or are we figuring out that what we thought was elegant is actually inherently problematic? And this is where I think DHH went wrong with TDD. that he was taking legitimate observations and laying them at the feet of TDD. He saw the corrosive effects but then blamed the end itself rather than seeing these as merely inevitable instances of people mistaking the means for the end. Now, if we back up a bit, it seems that we still have a struggle before we even get to the corrosive effects. I don't think trade-offs are a result of corrosion, as I've defined it, supplanting the means for the end. But that trade-offs are a mere difficulty in grasping the end due to either limitations in my thinking or just inherent constraints in the problem. So at this point, I want to trade out the language here that I've been using, elegance and trade-offs, for ideal and pragmatic, because I think these words also capture this struggle really well. All of the time we have to grapple with where do we draw the line in pursuit of the ideal in order to just keep things moving. And sometimes we know if we could just redesign some things first, then this new edition would be easier, but frequently we don't have the time to do this the right way, and instead oftentimes just get caught up in doing it this way, ending many days with defeat. Although, to be fair, unconstrained pursuit of the ideal doesn't always turn out so well either. So I think it's important to understand this conflict and bear it in mind, especially when we have discussions around design and architecture. For example, I just think we should be able to get like a new service up in 5 minutes. That would be great. Yeah, but if it was that easy, we'd just be spawning services all over the place and they'd turn into a nightmare. So you think we should just have a few fat services then? Well, no, that's the mess we have right now. Well, what do you think we should do? Well, we should have smaller services. Well, that's what I'm saying. Yes, but it's too expensive. And then, at this point, someone flips the plate of danishes off the conference room table and everyone goes back to work. So I think clarifying the context of statements is important and focusing on debating either the ideal we're shooting for or the current constraints, and maybe not both at the same time. And now for something completely different. Sort of. I mean, I guess we could consider this like a semi-bonus track, if you will. So in the last IsTDDDead hangout that they had, I think it was a week ago, if you bothered to wade through it all, there were some really interesting nuggets on the subject of confidence. So first, Kent addressed this from a technical perspective. Kent describes how TDD helps him drive out the specifics of a design. He's talking about grappling with a difficult problem, kind of takes a break, and then gets an idea of how he might be able to do this. So he's saying, I've had an insight, and I think if I only had a certain kind of object, a certain kind of API, then I can use that to help separate out the complexity. So I come up with a test with an example usage, and then right away I want to start seeing the implementation, because oftentimes the implementation is going to inform the API, and then basically goes on to describe this core concept of TDD, that it's a back and forth to help me as a developer focus on both the interface and the implementation at the same time. But beyond that, he also spent some time talking about, I think at a more personal level, what TDD and its role played in him for trying to transform his job and his work environment. So I know it's bad form to read slides, but I just think these quotes are great, so bear with me. Programmers are prone to masochism. We'll do things over and over again. We'll put up with complicated systems. We'll be in dysfunctional social relationships at work and figure, well, people will just always yell at me. I grew up being taught to expect that. I'm just not going to feel confident. I'm not going to be able to measure progress. I'm not going to know whether I had any impact. What I don't want to lose is that these expectations of programming work have evolved in the last 10 to 15 years. I should be able to feel confident. I should be able to point to my contributions. I should have productive technical collaboration. Those things weren't true, but they are true now, and I don't want to lose those. If I had to sell TDD to get those, I'd happily do it. To me, that's far more important, that I can be my whole self at work. For me, TDD was an important part of achieving those effects, but it's really the effects that matter. Then if you fast forward to the end of that last hangout, we get a little glimpse into part of DHH's motivation for getting into this. He says, for me, the purpose of getting involved was as much to give space to people I've talked to where TDD is not working for them, and they don't feel free to talk about it because they got accused of not being professional, because they weren't doing it right, because they weren't getting confidence out of it and feeling crappy about themselves. And reflecting back to when he gave his keynote, I know this isn't just DHH's opinion. I talked to a friend of mine who was there at RailsConf, and he said that he felt a little vindicated by that. And even at a recent lunch here in Dallas with the LS engineers, Chris Gibson was talking about that he just doesn't feel like he's got the same depth of experience with the subject, and at times during rants about DHH and Campfire didn't necessarily feel comfortable to speak up and share those experiences, which, on reflection, quickly led that back to myself. Now, I have no shortage of confidence and frustration on this subject when it comes to DHH. I don't believe he knows his history terribly well. I think he's jumping to conclusions that don't appear to be very thoughtful. And yet my own confidence and frustration can be a wall for somebody like Chris or others that DHH was mentioning who may not feel welcome to share their struggles or differences of opinion. And being confronted with that, I could see how I could contribute negatively to that. So any of you watching have had a similar experience, I would love to hear from you, or if you felt comfortable, I'd love for you to bring it up in Campfire so that we could all talk about it together. Because what's really fascinating to me about this last hangout between them was that the thing that drove Kent 15 years ago to promote TDD in the first place, and what drove DHH to call out TDD recently, was exactly the same thing. A desire to feel confident and to feel free in expressing oneself, or as Kent put it, to be my whole self at work. And our culture matters here very much. Sarah has started a post on our Starter Kit repo about this, and I believe strongly in working to have a culture of open and honest communication. The best people I've been privileged to work with have always been humble. They own up to what they don't know, and they've always been open to hearing from others. And that's what I personally strive for, though I frequently fail to attain it. So thanks. That's my talk. Thank you very much to Tyler and Natalia, anyone else behind the scenes who are working to make this stuff happen. I love that we're taking the time out to do these talks. It's cool stuff. Also, thanks to anyone waiting on me to do some payments work for them. And again, I'd love feedback on all this. It was kind of a meandering talk, but appreciate the opportunity.